the girl they called Worthless Asterisk. The autumn market was full of light and laughter. Colorful stalls stretched across the town square. Children ran between vendors, and the smell of sweet bread and spices filled the cool air. But in the middle of all that warmth stood Alara Vance, quiet and unnoticed, holding a small basket of herbs she had spent hours gathering. Her dress worn and faded, her hands rough from work, and her eyes carrying a tired softness that told a story no one cared to hear. People passed her without a glance. Some whispered behind her back, and others simply looked through her as if she did not exist, because in their world, someone like Alara had no value. She had come to the market not for herself, but for an old woman in her village who had fallen sick. Alara hoped to sell enough herbs to buy medicine, even if it meant standing there all day without food, because kindness was the only thing she had left, even when life had taken everything else from her. But kindness did not protect her from cruelty, and it did not stop the moment that would change her life forever. A sharp voice suddenly cut through the noise of the market, cold and loud enough to silence the crowd. And within seconds, people began to gather, forming a circle around Alara, as if they had been waiting for something like this to happen. A wealthy merchant stepped forward, his expression filled with disgust as he pointed directly at her, accusing her of stealing a silver coin from his stall. The accusation fell heavy in the air, and before Alara could even understand what was happening, the whispers began. People muttered words like thief and liar, and their voices grew louder with each passing second, turning into judgment without proof. Alara's hands trembled as she tried to explain. Her voice soft but desperate, she told them she had taken nothing, that she would never steal, but no one listened, because people had already decided who she was, and in their eyes, someone poor and alone was always guilty. The merchant demanded that she empty her basket, and when she did, nothing was found, but that was not enough. Someone shouted that she must be hiding it, and suddenly a hand pushed her forward. Another grabbed her arm, and the crowd closed in tighter, their curiosity turning into something darker. In the chaos, a small child near the front of the crowd stumbled and fell, crying out in fear as the people around him stepped back instead of helping, and without thinking, Alara broke free from the hands holding her and rushed to the child, kneeling beside him, her voice gentle as she wiped the tears from his face and checked if he was hurt. Even in that moment, when she herself was being accused and humiliated, she chose to protect someone else, and that simple act, so small and unnoticed by most, did not go unseen by the one person who mattered. From the edge of the crowd, hidden in plain sight, stood a tall figure dressed in dark clothing, his presence calm yet overwhelming, his eyes cold and sharp as they observed everything. He had not come for the market, nor for the people, but something had drawn him there, something he did not yet understand. And as he watched the girl everyone called worthless choose kindness over fear, something shifted inside him, something ancient and long forgotten. The merchant, growing impatient, struck Alara across the face, sending her to the ground, and the sound echoed through the square. Her lips split, a drop of blood falling onto the cold stone beneath her. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment, not out of sympathy, but out of shock. Yet still no one stepped forward to help her. No one except the silent figure whose gaze had never left her. Alara slowly pushed herself up, her face pale, her eyes filled with quiet pain, but there was no hatred in them, only sadness. And as she stood there, alone against the judgment of everyone around her, she did not know that her life had already begun to change, because the man watching her was not just anyone. He was the vampire king, ruler of the night, feared by all. And for the first time in centuries, something had caught his attention in a way nothing else ever had. And as her blood touched the ground, the king made a decision that would change both their fates forever. That night, the town fell quiet as darkness covered the streets. But inside a grand palace, hidden beyond the forest, the vampire king stood near a tall window, his gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once. The image of Alara kneeling beside the frightened child replaying in his mind in a way he could not explain. He had witnessed countless acts of cruelty, countless displays of weakness, and none of it had ever stirred anything within him. Yet this one human girl, fragile and humiliated, had chosen kindness when she had every reason to choose fear. And that simple choice had unsettled him more than any war ever could. He turned away from the window, his expression cold again, as if trying to bury whatever had surfaced inside him. But the feeling did not disappear. Instead, it sharpened, turning into something closer to curiosity, something he could not ignore. And with a quiet command, he summoned his most trusted guard, his voice calm yet absolute, as he ordered them to investigate the girl from the market. Every detail of her life, every truth hidden behind her silence. Because if something had the power to disturb his thoughts, it was something he needed to understand. Meanwhile, far from the palace, Alara walked slowly back to her small, broken home, her steps heavy, her body aching from the fall and the strike she had endured, the words of the crowd still echoing in her ears. Worthless, thief, nothing. Each one cutting deeper than the last, but she did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Instead, she focused on what mattered. The medicine she still needed to find, the people who depended on her, the quiet promise she had made to herself to keep going, no matter how many times the world tried to push her down. The next morning, whispers spread through the town like wildfire. Some claimed they had seen a shadow watching the market. Others spoke of a presence that did not belong among humans, but fear kept most of them silent, because everyone knew that when something unnatural entered their world, it was better not to speak of it. Alara, however, had no time for rumors. She returned to work as if nothing had happened, enduring the same cold looks and harsh words, yet continuing her duties with the same quiet patience that had defined her life. By midday, everything changed again. A group of armored riders entered the town, their presence alone enough to silence the streets. Their dark cloaks marked with a symbol everyone recognized, but no one dared to say aloud, the mark of the Vampire King. People stepped aside, lowering their eyes, fear spreading like a shadow over the town. And when the riders stopped in front of Alara, the silence became suffocating, because everyone knew that no one was chosen by the king without reason, and no reason ever ended well. Alara froze as one of the guards stepped forward, his voice steady as he spoke her name with a certainty that made her heart tighten. He informed her that she had been summoned to the palace, not as a prisoner, but as someone the king wished to see. The words made no sense to her, and they made even less sense to the people watching. Whispers turned into shock, and into something sharper. Jealousy, confusion, fear, because the same girl they had called worthless was now being called by the most powerful being in their world. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct inside her told her that nothing good could come from this. But she also knew she had no choice, and so, with trembling hands and a quiet breath, she stepped forward, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, unaware that she was walking into a world far more dangerous and far more complicated than anything she had faced before. As the riders escorted her away, the town watched in silence, some with fear, some with regret, and some with disbelief. But none of them understood the truth, that this was not a punishment, and it was not a coincidence. It was the beginning of something far greater than any of them could imagine, because the Vampire King did not summon people without purpose, and Alara Vance had just become that purpose. And deep within the palace, the king waited, not with anger, not with mercy, but with something far more dangerous interest. The palace was unlike anything Alara had ever seen, its towering walls carved from dark stone, its halls silent yet filled with an unseen presence that made her feel small with every step. The air itself felt colder, heavier, as if it carried centuries of power and secrets. And as she walked beside the guards, her heart pounded quietly in her chest, not from fear alone, but from the strange feeling that she did not belong there, that every shadow was watching her, judging her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Yet she kept her head slightly lowered, her steps careful, holding on to the same quiet strength that had carried her through her hardest days. When she was finally brought before the throne, the vast chamber seemed endless, tall pillars rising into darkness. And at the center of it all sat the Vampire King, his presence still and commanding, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made it impossible to look away for long. Elara lowered her gaze out of respect, expecting anger, expecting punishment, expecting the same cruel judgment she had faced her entire life, but none of it came. Instead, there was silence, long and heavy, as if he was studying not just her face, but something deeper, something even she did not fully understand. He asked her only a few questions, his voice calm but sharp, asking about the incident at the market, about her life, about the people she cared for. And though her voice trembled slightly, she answered honestly, without trying to defend herself too much, without trying to gain his sympathy, because she had learned that truth was the only thing she could hold on to, even when no one believed it. And as she spoke, something in the king's expression shifted, not enough for others to notice, but enough to reveal that he was listening more closely than he intended. Instead of sending her away or punishing her, he made a decision that confused everyone in the court. He ordered that she would remain in the palace under his protection, not as a prisoner, but as someone who would assist in simple duties among the servants. The whispers began immediately. Nobles exchanged glances filled with disbelief. Servants looked at her with curiosity, and some with quiet resentment, because a human, especially one of no status, had no place within the walls of such power. Yet the king's word was absolute, and no one dared to question it openly. Days passed slowly, and Elara began to adjust to her new life, though it was far from easy. Many of the palace staff treated her coldly, testing her patience, watching her closely, waiting for her to fail, but she did not respond with anger. She worked quietly, helping wherever she could, speaking gently even when others were harsh, and slowly, almost unnoticed, her presence began to change small things around her. A tired servant found relief when she helped with their work. A frightened child visiting the palace smiled when she spoke kindly. And even the guards, who once ignored her, began to see her as more than just another human. One evening, as she carried a tray through one of the quieter halls, she noticed a young servant sitting against the wall, clutching his arm in pain, a deep cut bleeding through the cloth. Others had passed him without stopping, too afraid to interfere or too used to ignoring suffering. But Elara knelt beside him without hesitation, tearing a piece of her own sleeve to wrap the wound, her hands steady, her voice soft as she reassured him. And though it was a simple act, it carried a weight that reached far beyond that moment. From the shadows of the hall, unseen and silent, the Vampire King watched, his expression unreadable, yet his gaze lingered longer than it should have. He had seen warriors fall without mercy, had witnessed kingdoms rise and burn, and none of it had ever moved him. Yet this girl, who had nothing, continued to give what little she had without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar began to grow within him, something he could not control, and perhaps did not want to dot, as Elara finished tending to the servant and quietly stood to leave. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know that every small action she took was slowly breaking through the walls of a heart that had been closed for centuries. And she certainly did not know that her presence in the palace was beginning to shift the balance of power in ways no one yet understood. because in a place ruled by fear and strength, her kindness was becoming something far more dangerous than either. Life inside the palace did not grow easier for Alara. Even as days passed, and her quiet presence began to soften a few hearts among the servants, the nobles remained cold, their eyes filled with silent judgment whenever she walked through the halls. Whispers followed her like shadows, words about her being unworthy, about how a human had no place among creatures of power, and though Alara heard them, she chose not to respond, not because she was weak, but because she had learned that her strength did not come from proving others wrong. It came from staying true to who she was, even when no one believed in her. However, beneath the surface of the palace, tension was growing. Some of the high-ranking nobles had begun to question the king's decision, meeting in secret, speaking in hushed tones about the danger of allowing a human so close to the throne. They believed it was a mistake, a weakness. And in a world where power was everything, weakness could not be tolerated. So they started to watch Alara more closely, waiting for any sign that they could use against her, any mistake that would justify removing her from the palace forever. One evening, as the sun set and the palace grew quieter, Alara was given a simple task: to carry a set of old scrolls to a sealed chamber deep within the lower halls. It was a place rarely visited, filled with ancient markings and relics from a time long forgotten. And though she felt a strange unease as she approached the heavy stone doors, she did not question the order, stepping inside with careful movements, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that barely revealed the symbols carved into the walls. Symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were a live dot as she placed the scrolls down. Her attention was drawn to a circular seal at the center of the room, its design intricate and unfamiliar, yet something about it felt strangely familiar, as if it was calling to her in a way she could not explain. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering above it, a quiet voice inside her warning her to step back. But another feeling, stronger and deeper, urged her forward. And before she could fully understand why, her fingers brushed against the surface of the seal. The reaction was instant. The symbols carved into the walls began to glow softly, a low hum filling the chamber as the air shifted around her. Alara stepped back in shock, her heart racing as light spread across the seal beneath her hand. And in that moment, something ancient awakened, something that had been dormant for centuries. The energy did not harm her. It surrounded her, almost as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting for her. And the realization sent a wave of confusion and fear through her, because nothing about this made sense. Elsewhere in the palace, the vampire king froze, his expression changing for the first time in days as he felt the shift in power, his senses sharp as he turned toward the direction of the sealed chamber. He knew that energy. He had not felt it in centuries, not since the old prophecies had been whispered in the earliest days of his reign, and without hesitation, he moved, his presence cutting through the halls like a shadow as he made his way to the source. When he entered the chamber, his gaze immediately found Alara standing near the glowing seal, her face pale, her eyes filled with confusion. And for a brief moment, silence filled the space between them, heavy and undeniable, because what he was seeing was not possible. And yet it was happening right before him. The ancient seal, a relic tied to the future of the vampire throne, was responding to her. A human girl who had been called worthless by everyone who knew her. Behind him, a few nobles who had followed at a distance witnessed the same thing, their shock quickly turning into fear, because they understood what this meant far better than Alara did. The old prophecy spoke of a queen, not born of noble blood, not raised in power, but chosen by something far older than the throne itself. And the moment they saw the seal respond to her, they knew that she was not just a mistake. She was a threat to everything they believed in. Alara looked at the king, her voice trembling as she tried to understand what was happening, but he did not answer immediately. His eyes still fixed on her, not with anger, not with doubt, but with something far more intense, something that confirmed what he had begun to feel the moment he first saw her, that she was not ordinary, that she was something the world had misunderstood, and something he could no longer ignore. And as the glow of the ancient seal slowly faded, one truth became impossible to deny. Ilara Vance was never meant to remain invisible. She was meant to be seen. The moment the ancient seal responded to Ilara, the palace changed, whispers turned into open defiance, and the nobles who had once hidden their resentment now spoke boldly, their voices sharp with fear and anger as they gathered in the grand hall, demanding answers, demanding control, because to them, the idea that a human girl, one with no name, no bloodline, and no power, could be connected to the throne was not just unacceptable. It was dangerous, and in their world, anything that threatened their position had to be destroyed before it could grow stronger. Ilara felt the shift immediately, the once quiet tension now heavy and suffocating. Servants avoided her, guards watched her more closely, and every step she took felt like walking through a storm, waiting to break. Yet she did not run. Even though fear rested in her chest, she stayed. Not because she believed she was strong, but because leaving would mean accepting the same truth the world had forced on her entire life, that she did not belong anywhere, and for the first time, she refused to accept that the nobles stood before the vampire king, their voices echoing through the hall as they demanded that Ilara be removed from the palace. Some called her a curse, others claimed she was manipulating ancient forces, and a few even suggested she should be imprisoned before her presence brought ruin to them all. Their words were filled with fear, but also with something deeper, something more dangerous, the fear of losing control, the fear that someone they had dismissed could rise beyond them. Through all of it, the king remained silent, seated upon his throne, his expression unreadable as he listened, his gaze occasionally shifting toward Ilara, who stood alone at the center of the hall, surrounded by judgment, just as she had been in the market. But this time, something was different. This time, she did not lower her head completely. Her fear was still there, but beneath it, there was something else, something stronger, a quiet strength that had begun to grow inside her, built from every moment she had endured and every kindness she had chosen despite it. Finally, the king rose, and the entire hall fell silent. His presence alone enough to command absolute attention, his voice calm but firm as he spoke, cutting through every accusation without raising his tone. He dismissed their claims, not with anger, but with certainty, stating that Ilara would remain under his protection, that no harm would come to her, and that anyone who defied that order would answer to him directly. The words were simple, but their meaning was absolute. And for the first time, the nobles realized that this was not a passing interest. This was a decision he would not take back. The tension broke into something sharper. Some nobles lowered their eyes in reluctant acceptance, while others hid their anger behind forced silence. But none dared to challenge him further, not openly, because they knew the cost of standing against their king. Yet beneath that forced obedience, something darker began to take root. Plans formed in quiet corners, alliances built on fear and ambition, because even if they could not confront him directly, they could still find ways to remove the problem. He refused to let go. Later that night, as the palace grew quiet once more, Ilara stood alone on a balcony, the cool air brushing against her face as she tried to steady her thoughts. Everything had changed so quickly, and yet she still felt like the same girl who had been called worthless in the market. She did not understand why the king had chosen to protect her. She did not understand the meaning behind the ancient seal. And more than anything, she did not understand why. Despite all the fear surrounding her, she felt a small, fragile sense of belonging for the first time in her life. She did not hear him approach, but she felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet presence that had become impossible to ignore. And when she turned, she found the vampire king standing behind her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. Though still guarded, still controlled, he did not speak immediately. And neither did she, because in that silence, something passed between them. Something that did not need words, a recognition. A connection that had been building slowly with every moment they had shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and certain. He told her that she did not have to face this alone, that whatever was coming, he would not allow harm to reach her. And though the words were simple, they carried a weight that went far beyond protection, because for the first time, Alara realized that she was not just someone he had chosen to keep safe. She was someone he refused to lose, and as she looked at him, her fear did not disappear, but it changed, turning into something stronger, something that allowed her to stand a little taller, because in a world that had always pushed her down, someone had finally chosen to stand beside her. But neither of them knew that the greatest danger had not yet revealed itself, and the next test would decide everything. The storm that had been building inside the palace finally broke, not with whispers, but with betrayal, as the nobles who had secretly plotted against Alara made their move under the cover of night. Their plan simple but ruthless: remove her before she could become something they could no longer control. They lured her into the lower halls once more, using false orders and hidden intentions, believing that without the king present, she would be easy to silence, easy to erase, just like so many others who had stood in their way before. Alara walked into the trap unaware, her trust in the palace still fragile but growing. And when the doors sealed behind her and the nobles revealed themselves, their expressions cold and merciless, she felt fear rise within her once again. The same fear she had known her entire life. The fear of being alone against those who held power. But this time, something inside her did not break. It held steady, because she was no longer the same girl who had stood helpless in the market. She had changed, even if she did not fully realize it yet. They accused her of being a threat, of bringing imbalance, of daring to stand where she did not belong. Their words sharp and filled with anger, but beneath it all was fear. Fear of what she represented, and when they moved closer, intending to end everything quietly, the chamber responded once again. The ancient symbols igniting with a brighter, stronger light than before, the energy rising around Alara, not wild or destructive, but controlled, protective, as if it was answering her presence, not rejecting it at that same moment. The vampire king felt the surge of power once more, stronger than before, impossible to ignore, and without hesitation, he moved, his speed cutting through the palace like a shadow, his presence dark and unstoppable. Because this time, there was no question in his mind, no hesitation, only one clear truth, that Alara was in danger, and he would not allow it. When he arrived, the chamber was filled with light. The nobles stepping back in shock as the ancient power surrounded her, and for the first time, they understood that they had made a mistake far greater than they could fix. Because this was not something they could control or destroy. This was something chosen by forces older than any of them. And standing at the center of it all was the girl they had called worthless. The king stepped forward, his presence immediately silencing the room, his eyes burning with a cold fury that none dared to challenge. And in that moment, he did not speak as a ruler addressing his court. He spoke as someone who had made a decision beyond power and beyond tradition. He declared that Alara was under his protection, not by choice, but by right, that the ancient seal had recognized her, and that no one would stand against that truth without facing the consequences. The nobles fell silent, their fear now undeniable, and one by one, they lowered their heads, not out of respect for her, but out of fear of him. Yet even in that, something had changed, because for the first time, Alara was no longer standing alone. She was standing beside the one person in the kingdom who held absolute power. And that power was now on her side. Days later, the palace gathered once more. But this time not for judgment, not for accusation, but for something no one had expected. The grand hall filled with nobles, guards, and servants alike, all watching as Alara stood at the center, her presence calm, her expression no longer uncertain. She had not become someone else. She had simply become stronger in who she already was. And when the vampire king approached her, the room fell into complete silence. Without hesitation, he placed the crown upon her head, a symbol not just of power, but of recognition, of choice, of everything she had endured and everything she had become. And in that moment, the same people who had once whispered against her now bowed, because they could no longer deny the truth, that the girl they had rejected had become their queen. Alara did not smile with pride or triumph. She simply stood with quiet strength, her eyes soft but steady, because she had not sought power. She had not fought for a throne. She had only chosen kindness when the world gave her cruelty. And in the end, that had been enough to change everything. As the king stood beside her, his gaze no longer distant, but certain, the bond between them no longer unspoken, the story reached its final truth. That power does not always come from strength alone. Sometimes it comes from the courage to remain kind in a world that tries to break you. And as the hall remained bowed before her, one truth echoed through every corner of the kingdom: never call someone worthless, because you may be standing before a future queen.